The B-29 pilot who saw US troops vanish. As Viet Cong fought South Korea underground, the jungle exploded beneath me at 2:47 p.m. on October 15, 1966, and in that moment I watched 37 American soldiers disappear into the earth as if the ground itself had opened its mouth to swallow them whole. The super fortress shuddered around me, aluminum groaning against the updraft of heat and smoke that rose from what had been solid ground seconds before, and through the plexiglass nose I could see shadows moving in the crater, human shapes locked in combat where no humans should exist. My hands gripped the yoke so hard my knuckles went white, the altimeter reading 8.0 feet, but feeling like I was staring straight into hell's basement, watching Viet Cong fighters emerge from tunnels to clash with South Korean Marines in an underground maze that stretched God knows how far beneath the jungle floor. The smell of burning earth filled the cockpit even at altitude, a sulphurous stench that made my stomach turn as I realized what I was witnessing wasn't just a ground collapse. It was the revelation of an entire war happening beneath our war. A subterranean nightmare where men fought and died in darkness while we flew overhead, ignorant as angels. The radio crackled with panicked voices, coordinates that made no sense, casualty reports for soldiers who had simply vanished into the belly of Vietnam itself. None of them knew that what waited beneath their boots had already claimed hundreds, that the earth they walked on was nothing but a thin crust over a labyrinth of death. If you're here to understand how an entire unit vanished in seconds, stay with me until the end. And subscribe. Because these memories need witnesses. Tell me where you're watching from, because this story belongs to anyone who's ever wondered what really happened in those jungles. To understand how I ended up in that sky over Vietnam, we need to go back to a farm outside Topeka, Kansas, where a 12-year-old boy first heard the thunder of B-29's flying training missions out of Forbes Field. My father worked wheat, but I worked dreams, spending every afternoon flat on my back in the tall grass, watching those silver giants cut across the endless sky like mechanical gods. The sound they made wasn't just noise, it was promise, power, the future written in contrails and engine roar. My mother would call me for supper and find me still there at dusk, neck craned skyward, memorizing every rivet and line of those beautiful machines. When the war ended in 45, I was 15 and heartbroken that I'd missed my chance to fly them in combat. But by 47, I was at the recruiting station, lying about my age and signing papers that would change everything. Training was salvation and damnation rolled into one brutal package. They broke us down to raw nerves and rebuilt us as extensions of the aircraft, teaching us to think in altitudes and coordinates, to breathe in fuel ratios and exhaust velocities. The B-29 became more than a machine. It was a living thing that required blood sacrifice to function properly, demanding perfect coordination between 10 crew members, or it would turn from savior to tomb in the span of a heartbeat. I learned to love the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that strategic bombing could end wars or start them, that we were the sharp edge of American power projected across oceans. The instructors were men who had flown over Japan, who had seen cities disappear beneath their bombs, and lived with the knowledge that their decisions had ended more lives in single missions than most soldiers would see in entire wars. They taught us that the B-29 was a weapon of precision, but also of moral complexity, that every time we climbed into that cockpit, we were carrying the future of warfare in our hands. But nothing they taught us in training prepared us for the reality of Vietnam, where the enemy didn't wear uniforms or follow conventional warfare rules, where the very ground beneath your feet could be hiding an army. The superfortress had been designed to fight enemies who built factories and cities, who concentrated their forces in ways that made strategic bombing effective. Vietnam was different. It was a war against shadows and tunnels, against an enemy that had learned to make the entire countryside into a weapon. Every village could hide a company of fighters, every rice paddy could conceal supply routes, every hill and valley could be honeycombed with tunnels that connected to networks stretching hundreds of miles across the country. We were flying the most advanced bomber in the world against an enemy that had gone underground so completely that our entire technological advantage was rendered meaningless. I arrived in country in March of 1966, assigned to the 307th Strategic Wing operating out of Utapao Royal Thai Navy Airfield, and the first thing that hit me wasn't the heat or humidity, it was the smell. Vietnam smelled like death and life locked in eternal combat, rotting vegetation mixed with cordite and fear sweat, a jungle perfume that got into your clothes and stayed there no matter how many times you washed them. The briefings painted a simple picture: support ground operations, hit strategic targets, deny the enemy sanctuary. But the reality was more complex, more terrifying. The Viet Cong had turned the entire countryside into a weapon, using tunnel systems that predated our involvement by decades, creating an underground nation that existed parallel to the surface world. Our intelligence was scattered, contradictory, often hours out of date by the time it reached us. Ground commanders spoke in whispers about entire patrols that simply vanished, about firefights that seemed to come from the earth itself, about an enemy that could appear and disappear like smoke. The thing that really got to us was the stories about tunnel complexes so vast they had hospitals, supply depots, command centers, even theaters and schools carved into the living rock and clay. Soldiers would tell you about hearing voices underground, about feeling vibrations beneath their feet during supposedly quiet operations, about the paranoia that came from knowing that every step might be over an enemy soldier's head. The psychological warfare was as effective as any conventional weapon, knowing that your enemy could be anywhere, could strike from any direction, that the very earth you walked on might collapse beneath you without warning. But what they didn't tell us, what nobody wanted to acknowledge, was that the South Koreans had figured out how to fight that war. The AROK Marines had a reputation that made grown men shiver, not just for their ferocity above ground, but for their willingness to follow the Viet Cong into their own tunnels, to fight hand-to-hand in spaces so tight you couldn't raise your rifle, where combat was reduced to knives and teeth and the desperate will to survive. The Korean War had taught them things about close-quarters fighting that no American military manual covered, lessons written in blood in the frozen hills of Chosin and Heartbreak Ridge. They understood that modern warfare could be reduced to its most primitive elements, that all the technology and training in the world meant nothing when you were face-to-face with an enemy in a space barely wide enough for one man. The ROK Marines had developed tactics specifically for tunnel fighting, specialized weapons, modified equipment, communication systems that worked underground, even psychological preparation for combat in total darkness. They had studied Viet Cong tunnel construction techniques, mapped known networks, and developed countermeasures that went far beyond what American forces were prepared to implement. When they disappeared into the earth, they weren't just conducting reconnaissance, they were fighting a parallel war that most American commanders didn't even know existed. Intelligence reports started filtering through about coordinated underground operations, about battles being fought in tunnel networks where American troops on the surface couldn't provide support or even comprehend what was happening beneath their feet. The South Koreans would disappear into the earth like miners heading for the coalface, emerging hours later with stories that sounded like fiction. Multi-level tunnel systems connected by passages hundreds of yards long, underground rivers that the Viet Cong used for transportation, chambers large enough to house entire companies of enemy fighters. They spoke of artificial lighting powered by generators hidden so deep underground that their noise couldn't be detected on the surface, of supply routes that connected tunnel networks across entire provinces, of workshops where weapons were manufactured and repaired in chambers carved from bedrock. Our job was supposed to be air support, But how do you provide air support for a war happening 50 feet underground? The reports grew more disturbing as the months passed. ROC Marines described encountering Viet Cong fighters who had been living underground for years, men who had become so adapted to tunnel warfare that they moved through the darkness with an efficiency that bordered on supernatural. These weren't guerrilla fighters hiding in holes. They were soldiers who had transformed the underground into their natural habitat, who knew every passage and chamber in networks that stretched for miles, who could navigate in total darkness and fight effectively in spaces that would drive most men insane with claustrophobia. The tunnel systems weren't just military installations, they were entire underground cities, complete with kitchens, sleeping quarters, meeting rooms, even recreation areas where fighters could rest between operations. The Viet Cong had created a parallel civilization beneath the surface of Vietnam, one that was invisible to aerial reconnaissance and impervious to conventional bombing. The mission brief on October 15th was routine on paper: support a joint US-ROC operation in the Iron Triangle, an area so honeycombed with tunnels it looked like Swiss cheese on the maps. 3 companies of American infantry were tasked with securing the surface, while ROC Marines conducted what they euphemistically called subsurface reconnaissance. Our B-29 was flying high cover, ready to deliver ordnance on targets of opportunity. But the real action was supposed to happen below ground level. The briefing officer was nervous, sweating through his khaki shirt despite the air conditioning, and he kept referring to intelligence reports that were classified above our clearance level. What he did tell us was that seismic sensors had detected massive underground movement in the area, that aerial reconnaissance had spotted new tunnel entrances appearing overnight, and that previous operations in the region had resulted in casualty rates that didn't make sense for the level of surface contact reported. The photographs they showed us were disturbing. Aerial shots that revealed patterns in the jungle that suggested extensive underground construction, subtle depressions in the earth that indicated collapsed or filled-in tunnels, vegetation growth that followed lines too straight and regular to be natural. Intelligence analysts had identified at least 40 separate tunnel entrances in a grid covering less than 5 square miles, but they suspected the actual number was much higher. What made the briefing truly unsettling was the admission that previous operations had failed to map the full extent of the tunnel network, that teams of engineers and cave specialists had been lost attempting to explore passages that seemed to extend indefinitely into the bedrock. The Iron Triangle wasn't just a geographic region. It was a fortress that extended vertically through layers of earth and rock, a 3-dimensional battlefield where conventional military thinking meant nothing. We took off into a sky that looked wrong from the first moment, clouds building in patterns that seemed unnatural, the air itself feeling heavy with anticipation. The superfortress climbed toward operational altitude with a reluctance I'd never felt before, as if the aircraft knew something we didn't about what waited ahead. Radio chatter was minimal, clipped exchanges between ground units and command that carried an undercurrent of tension nobody wanted to acknowledge. At 8,000 feet, the jungle spread below us like a green carpet, hiding everything that mattered, and I found myself staring at the earth with a new understanding of how little we really knew about what we were fighting. The landscape looked peaceful from altitude, almost pastoral, but I knew that beneath that canopy of vegetation was a network of passages and chambers where men were preparing for battles that would never appear on any map or casualty report. The first sign something was wrong came at 14:42 hours, when ground control reported seismic activity inconsistent with known Viet Cong tunnel construction. The tremors were too regular, too coordinated, more like controlled demolitions than random excavation. Then came reports of surface subsidence in the target area, patches of jungle floor sinking several feet without warning, creating natural trenches and fighting positions that hadn't existed on any map. The American companies spread out to establish a perimeter, while the ROK Marines prepared to descend into the tunnel network. But what none of us realized was that we were flying over a battlefield that had been prepared for months, where every tree and rock had been positioned to conceal entrances and exits to an underground war zone. The Viet Cong weren't just hiding in tunnels. They had turned the entire landscape into a trap, using surface features to disguise a military installation that existed primarily below ground. At 1447, the earth opened. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, as if someone had pulled a cosmic trapdoor beneath 37 American soldiers. I watched through binoculars as the jungle floor simply wasn't there anymore, replaced by a crater 60 feet across and at least 20 feet deep, and in the bottom of that crater I could see movement, human figures locked in hand-to-hand combat, muzzle flashes from weapons fired in near-total darkness, the flash of steel as knives found their marks in fights too close for bullets. The radio exploded with chaos, voices overlapping as ground commanders tried to process what they were seeing, casualty reports that made no sense, requests for support that couldn't be answered because nobody understood what kind of support was needed. The crater had revealed cross-sections of tunnel levels stacked one above another, like looking into a multi-story building that had been sliced open with a giant knife. But I could see it all from my position in the sky, and what I saw defied everything I thought I knew about warfare. The Viet Cong hadn't just built tunnels. They'd built a fortress, a multi-level complex with fighting positions carved into the walls, supply routes that connected to surface exits hundreds of yards away, even what looked like vehicle ramps leading down into the earth. The structural engineering was remarkable. Support beams and reinforced passages that had taken years to construct. Ventilation systems that allowed large numbers of fighters to operate underground for extended periods. Even what appeared to be drainage systems to prevent flooding during the monsoon season. And the South Koreans weren't just following them down. They were fighting them on equal terms, using tactics and weapons designed specifically for underground combat, moving through the tunnels with a precision that spoke of extensive training and experience. This wasn't reconnaissance. This was the climax of a campaign that had been going on for months without our knowledge. The smoke rising from the crater carried the smell of cordite and blood, of earth disturbed by explosives, and the metallic tang of weapons fired in confined spaces. American soldiers at the perimeter were firing down into the hole, but their weapons couldn't reach the real battle happening in the tunnel network below, where ROK Marines and Viet Cong fighters were engaged in a three-dimensional chess match played with grenades and assault rifles. I could see Korean soldiers emerging from tunnel entrances that hadn't been there moments before, coordinating surface attacks with underground movements in a way that suggested they'd been mapping this network for weeks. The Viet Cong were falling back through prepared positions, collapsing tunnel sections behind them to slow pursuit. But the South Koreans kept coming, pushing deeper into a maze that extended far beyond what our intelligence had suggested. Bodies were falling in both directions, into the crater from the surface and up from the tunnels below, but the majority of casualties were happening in spaces I couldn't see, in passages and chambers where men fought and died in darkness so complete that muzzle flashes were the only source of illumination. What haunted me wasn't the violence. I'd seen violence before, had delivered it from 30. It drove 0 feet with payload after payload of high explosive. What haunted me was the realization that we'd been fighting the wrong war, that while we focused on controlling territory on the surface, an entirely different conflict had been raging beneath our feet. The 37 soldiers who vanished into that crater were just the visible casualties of a campaign that had claimed hundreds, maybe thousands of lives in fighting so intense and so hidden that it might as well have been happening on another planet. The jungle had swallowed them, but it was the tunnel system that digested them, processing American soldiers through a maze designed to kill anything that entered it. Every passage was a potential death trap, every chamber a potential tomb, every intersection a place where men could die without their bodies ever being recovered. The Viet Cong had turned the earth itself into a weapon, and we had walked into it blind and unprepared. Our maps were useless, our intelligence was months out of date. Our tactics were designed for surface warfare against conventional enemies. The Arok Marines were the only ones who understood what we were really fighting, who had adapted to the reality of underground combat, but even they were struggling against an enemy that had been preparing this battlefield for years. The crater had revealed only a small section of what intelligence later determined was a tunnel network covering nearly 100 square miles, with passages extending down through multiple levels, some reaching depths of over 200 feet below the surface. It was an underground city built specifically for warfare, with choke points and kill zones designed to trap and destroy any invading force. The aftermath was chaos, wrapped in official silence. Rescue operations recovered 23 bodies from the crater and tunnel entrances, but 14 soldiers were simply gone, vanished into a network too complex and too dangerous to fully explore. The ROK Marines emerged 3 days later from tunnel exits 12 miles away, carrying intelligence that was immediately classified and stories that were never officially recorded. What I learned later, through channels that didn't exist on any organizational chart, was that the tunnel system extended across most of the Iron Triangle, that it had taken the Viet Cong 7 years to construct, and that the South Koreans had been fighting in it for 8 months before our joint operation exposed it to American forces. The network included workshops for manufacturing weapons and explosives, medical facilities for treating wounded fighters, storage areas for food and ammunition, even command centers where operations were planned and coordinated. It was a complete military infrastructure built beneath the earth, invisible to aerial reconnaissance and immune to conventional bombing. They grounded me 2 weeks later, medical discharge for combat stress, but the real reason was simpler. I'd seen too much, understood too clearly how little we comprehended about the war we were fighting. The nightmares started immediately, dreams where I was flying endless circles over craters that opened and closed like mouths, swallowing aircraft and crews with the casual indifference of a predator feeding. I'd wake up tasting cordite and jungle rot, feeling the weight of responsibility for lives I couldn't save because I didn't understand they needed saving until it was too late. The B-29 became a symbol of my failure, a beautiful machine rendered useless by an enemy that fought wars we couldn't comprehend with weapons we couldn't target. All our technological superiority, all our firepower and precision bombing capabilities meant nothing against an enemy that had simply moved the battlefield to a place where we couldn't reach them. Years passed before I could talk about what I'd seen. Decades before I understood that October 15th, 1966, was the day American involvement in Vietnam shifted from conventional warfare to something darker, more complex. A conflict where victory was measured not in territory controlled, but in knowledge gained about an enemy that lived and fought in spaces we couldn't reach. The tunnel networks were eventually destroyed, bombed and gassed, and collapsed by engineering units that worked for months to eliminate every entrance and exit. But the knowledge remained, the understanding that modern warfare could be three-dimensional in ways that made our technological advantages meaningless, that determination and preparation could trump firepower when the battlefield was chosen carefully enough. The Viet Cong had proven that an enemy willing to go underground, literally and figuratively, could neutralize even the most sophisticated military force, could turn the earth itself into an ally in ways that no conventional army could counter. I still dream about those shadows moving in the crater, about the sound of gunfire echoing from underground chambers, about 37 American soldiers who walked into a jungle and fell through the earth itself, into a war that predated their involvement and outlasted their sacrifice. The B-29 was retired from service in 1960, but my particular aircraft, tail number 4487766, was recommissioned for Vietnam specifically because of its long-range capabilities and bombing accuracy. It served until 1969, flying missions over targets that existed only in the imagination of intelligence officers who had never seen a tunnel network from the inside. The aircraft was scrapped in 1971, cut apart and sold for aluminum, but somewhere in a warehouse in Texas there's still a piece of plexiglass from the nose section, and if you look through it at just the right angle, on just the right kind of afternoon, you can see straight down into the earth itself, into spaces where men fought wars that will never appear in any history book. What I saw that day was supposed to be impossible, but the jungle proved us all wrong. Some wars are fought above the trees, others beneath the roots, and sometimes the ground opens up to show you exactly how little you understand about the world you're trying to save. The tunnel networks are gone now, collapsed and overgrown. But somewhere in the archives there are maps drawn by rock marines who fought room to room through chambers carved from living rock. And those maps tell a story that will never make it into the official histories. They tell the story of a war fought in the dark, where victory was measured in yards of tunnel cleared and enemies that appeared and disappeared like smoke, where American soldiers learned too late that their enemy had turned the entire country into a weapon pointed at the sky.